All right, today we talk about the infamous Stanford prison experiment. It really is, for anybody who's taken a psychology course, you can usually say Stanford prison experiment and they know exactly what you're talking about. It's sort of that level of infamy. But it also makes a really, really important point that I think we all have to keep in mind whenever we see somebody do something that we think we would never do. Because the Stanford prison effect is all about, or the Stanford prison experiment is all about the power that context has in shaping the way we behave. Um, let's just talk about it, because once we go through it, I think we can make that point more and more clearly. All right, here goes. Week 6, Lecture 4. Why good people do bad things. And you see, I've kind of stolen that from a book that I will highlight here. A book by this man, Zimbardo. So Zimbardo, as a much younger psychologist than it's Philip Zimbardo, by the way, than pictured here, decided to do this interesting experiment. Now, this was in the 60s, and Zimbardo was really interested in authority and the whole interaction, I guess, between people who have some authority and those who do not. Again, the 60s, think of that rebellious time. Zimbardo was in Stanford, so, West Coast, all your notions of 60s and hippies and psychedelic music and whatever you want to think about, that's the context in which these experiments occurred. And this is actually an ad for the experiment. Male college students needed for a psychological study of prison life. $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks. This sounded pretty good to a lot of people because, basically you just were going to come in and either be a prisoner or be a guard for 2 weeks, getting $15 per day. So it's kind of like, okay, even if I'm a prisoner, I just sit around in a cell all day for 2 weeks and I make a little pocket full of money. Not bad. Beginning August 14th, which is my birthday, by the way, kind of cool. For further information, off you go. So this was just posted in the newspaper, and people applied. And they would come in and they would meet Phil Zimbardo, who is, by the way, a very well-known figure within psychology, very well-known also for his teaching and his writing, so really bringing psychology to everybody, I guess. Good. He's written a number of books, and I highly recommend anybody interested more in checking a lot of what Phil Zimbardo has done. He's also got a lot of TV shows and things like that. All right, now here's the critical thing. These individuals came into the lab. Now I'm going to highlight this for a couple of reasons. We're going to see it in a number of experiments. But when they came into the lab, they were just young men. But they were then randomly assigned to play the role of either guard or prisoner. They weren't told which at first, so they just came in and talked and applied, and somewhere Phil Zimbardo flipped a little coin or whatever and decided for each member whether they were going to be a guard or a prisoner. Now, here's the important issue with random selection or random assignment. The important aspect of it is that if you really randomly make somebody adopt either the prisoner role or the guard role, there's no reason to suspect there would be any other systematic difference between those groups. So we don't expect, for example, to have all the aggressive people become guards and all the submissive ones prisoners. That would be kind of odd if we're just flipping a coin for that to happen. We hope that the randomness will create two groups of people who are not really systematically different in any way. And so now the experiment will, if we ultimately see differences in behavior of these two people, we can assume those differences are due to the experimental context, not due to some pre-existing difference. So if we took all the tall people and made them guards and the shorter people and made them prisoners, well, then we might be worried that there's something else at play, something that is related to height. But when you do it randomly, you can feel pretty comfortable that whatever you ultimately see came about because of the experiment itself. So now in this experiment, people just came in, they did their interview, they were randomly assigned to a group, they didn't know which. But then, when the experiment was about to begin, the guards were all first called in, and they were given outfits like what you see. Just sort of guard-like outfits, various paraphernalia, and a critical bit of paraphernalia was the sunglasses. This is always seen as really important in these situations because it gives you a sort of mask, as it were, allows you to wear an alternate persona of a sort. And so this is how the guards were all equipped. And then later on that same day, the police force who were in on this, they wanted to make it as real as possible, so they went and arrested the prisoners at their homes. So they literally came to the prisoners' homes as part of the experiment and arrested them, brought them to the police office, put them through the whole, pictures, fingerprints, booking kind of activity, and then ultimately brought them to Stanford, a basement in Stanford that was set up like jail cells. So a bunch of rooms were converted so that this area ultimately became the Stanford prison. Okay, the prison in the basement of the psychology building of Stanford. Prisoners were equipped with shirts like this with numbers, and the guards were again equipped as seen. Very little instruction was given to them except for the following. So Zimbardo cast himself as the superintendent of the prison, the man ultimately in charge, but he really led with a weak hand, so to speak. What he wanted to do is see how these participants kind of fit into the situation. What did they do? And so the guards' role was literally to keep order. They were told, these are prisoners, and your role is to control the prisoners, keep them in line, make sure they do the things they have to do. And the prisoners, of course, were just prisoners. And so Zimbardo just kind of set that up and let it run. And early on, things went kind of weird. Everybody thought it was kind of a bit of a joke, who's a prisoner, who's a guard. And in fact, a lot of people, when they were interviewed afterwards, said they were kind of hoping at the beginning to be prisoners. They thought prisoners would be an easier thing to be. But over time, a bunch of weird things happened. And you're kind of seeing some of these depicted here. The guards, at first, the prisoners were kind of joking with them and being insubordinate, I guess, and they weren't taking the whole thing seriously. And at some point, the guards, and especially one guard, let me go back, especially this guy who's become relatively famous, at some point decided, hey, I'm a guard. I'm going to exert some control. And so he started getting very tough, very authoritative with the prisoners. And then the other guards slowly started to follow his lead. So over time, they would start to ask the prisoners to do a bunch of things, like turn to the wall and put their hands there. He would ask them to count out. They had to count numbers. They'd have to stand for a long time in a given position, push-ups, sit-ups, all that kind of stuff. So denying them bed sheets when they went to bed at night. If they were misbehaving, they would remove their bed sheets. So they'd start to do things like that. It escalated. There was an area that was sort of a closet, and they would put people in there if they were misbehaving and lock them in there for a while, like a solitary confinement kind of thing. And it actually got to the point where at one point they made them strip naked and have bags over their heads. They could only ever respond to their number, not their name, so they de-individuated them. And it really kind of got out of hand. In fact, at some point, some of these patients started to have nervous breakdowns. And we're talking about 2 days into the experiment here, not very far in. But it really escalated. The guards really started to act more and more guard-like. The prisoners really started to act more and more oppressed and show those feelings. And the weird sort of subtext to the whole story is that Zimbardo kind of looked on. And he looked on in amazement and in fascination of what he was seeing. He was kind of saying, well, this started out as two random groups of people. And then suddenly you see a prison culture emerge. And you see one group of people suddenly acting very nasty, very aggressive, very authoritative. And they weren't that when they came in. They were 60s California kids. But suddenly they were transforming into a much more, I don't know whether you want to call it evil, but they certainly bullied these people. They certainly did a lot of nasty things to the prisoners, to the point where they were causing some prisoners real psychological trauma. and that was the fascinating thing. And at some point, you know, the famous story is that Zimbardo's girlfriend at the time came in and he wanted to show her what was going on with pride. Like, look at what I've created in just 2 days. Look at what's happened here. And like, he didn't really create it. He just created the context. But look at what this context has created. And he thought it was amazing. She thought it was horrific. When she saw prisoners going to the washroom naked with a bag over their head in a line, you know, having to follow these orders that the guards were laying out, she thought this was immoral and wrong and that the experiment should stop. And essentially had a fight with Zimbardo on that front. You know, him actually apparently accusing her of really not being a good psychologist if she didn't see how fascinating this was, and her, I think, counter-accusing him of not being a very good human being if he couldn't see how horrific it was. And eventually he did, and he shut it down. But, you know, the remnants of that experiment live on. In fact, Zimbardo himself recently published a book called The Lucifer Effect, where he makes the following startling connection. Well, it's not really startling when you think about it, but he said when the Abu Ghraib prison scandal was breaking in America and we were seeing those images of what American soldiers were doing to Iraqi prisoners, he immediately, when he saw those images, thought of the Stanford prison experiment. It looked to him like the exact same thing was going on. The bullying, the people, you know, that were stripped naked with bags over their head, nasty things being done to them. So he said, you know, this is the Stanford prison experiment. It's just a real prison, but it's the same phenomenon. What is that phenomenon? This is the critical point. The phenomenon was that the context encouraged and rewarded that sort of behavior, that sort of aggressive, nasty behavior, that evil kind of behavior. And he argues in this book that that's the same thing going on in Abu Ghraib. And the reason that it's an important thing to realize is that what ultimately happened in the Abu Ghraib prison scandal is that 2 or 3 soldiers were labeled as bad apples, as the ones that caused all the evil. They were charged, they were put in jail. Zimbardo does not argue that they should not be charged. He agrees that, you know, anybody who conducts evil should pay the price. But what he also argues is that the people that created that context also should pay the price. And, you know, he says those people go right up, you know, as far as the vice president and maybe even the president in that case, that they all created a context much like he had, and they put these guards in this situation where they were asked to, say, soften up prisoners and things like that, and that ultimately the context in which these people were in permitted and maybe even encouraged evil behavior. And when we're in that context, this is the larger, scarier point, when we're in that context, any of us might do the same. You know, we're back to almost thinking Milgram, right? But Milgram, it was an authority figure standing over you. In the case of the Stanford prison experiment, it's the actual context we find ourselves in. And if that context encourages a certain kind of behavior, and if everyone around you is okay with you being this bully, this tough, this nasty kind of person, and especially if they encourage it, then it's going to come out. And it may come out of a lot of people. We may suddenly see a dark side of people because of the context. And, you know, in Zimbardo's effect, this is a core part of why even good people can perform evil acts. And that when we think about it, think of the context and the person, we can't, it's naive and simple-minded to just blame the person and to just focus on the person. That if we want to prevent evil, we have to also consider the context, and we have to make sure that if evil contexts are created, then those responsible for creating those contexts should also be responsible for the evil. Big idea. And, you know, if you kind of roll it in with Milgram and things like that, you imagine now an evil context with an authority figure telling you what to do, then maybe you get a picture that explains things like Nazi concentration camps. And you know, similar kinds of situations in life. So, yeah, powerful stuff. Powerful experiment. Again, this is one of those experiments that you're not really going to appreciate until you see it. And here's a couple of opportunities to see it. Footage from the actual experiment, so you should check those out. There is, in fact, a Stanford prison experiment website. There's a website that literally shows you all about it, tells you all about it. You should really check that out. And then there's an interesting, there's a number of interesting things that you'll find on YouTube as well, and you'll have snippets of them here where they talk a little bit about interviews with the people, including that very tough guard. He was very willing afterwards to talk about the experience, the transformation that he kind of felt he went through, and what he ultimately thinks about all that. So there's fascinating stuff in there as well, and some of that mentioned in the BBC After story. So check it out. I guarantee you, you will leave these videos thinking a little differently about how you think about evil and the situations in which it emerges. So interesting, cool, if not somewhat dark. All right. Yeah, we're going to continue talking about context in the next one, but in a slightly different way. Way that maybe is more related to things you see in your everyday life. It's something specifically called the bystander effect. So come on back for the next lecture. We'll talk about that.